That evening began like countless others before it, with me stepping out of my apartment after a long and mentally draining workday, my head heavy with unfinished thoughts, my body tense from sitting alone, and my only real plan being to clear my mind by going for a familiar jog through the quiet suburban neighborhood I had run through dozens of times before, without incident. The sky was caught in that calm transition between daylight and night, where the sun hadn't fully disappeared, but the air had already cooled enough to justify pulling a hoodie over my head, not as a disguise or statement, but simply as a practical layer against the chill and a small comfort that helped me settle into my rhythm. I adjusted my earbuds, set my pace, and began jogging along the sidewalk past rows of nearly identical houses with trimmed lawns, parked cars reflecting the fading light, and porch lights flickering on one by one, creating a peaceful backdrop that made it easy to forget the stress of the day. As I ran, my focus narrowed to the steady sound of my breath, the soft impact of my shoes against the pavement, and the familiar route unfolding ahead of me, a loop I had memorized so well that I rarely needed to look up unless a car passed or another pedestrian approached. About 10 minutes into the run, as I rounded a corner near the middle of the neighborhood, I noticed a woman standing near the edge of her driveway, her posture stiff, her phone held loosely in one hand, and her gaze fixed in my direction in a way that felt deliberate rather than casual. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than idle curiosity, because joggers naturally draw attention in quiet neighborhoods, but as I got closer, I became increasingly aware that her eyes were tracking my movement rather than simply acknowledging my presence. When I was just about to pass her, she took a small step toward the sidewalk and called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through my music and force me to slow down, turning what should have been a continuous run into an unexpected confrontation. I pulled one earbud out and turned my head toward her, confused but still calm, expecting a routine question about directions or parking rather than the scrutiny that immediately followed. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my hoodie before meeting my face, and asked why I was running around the neighborhood dressed like that, her tone carrying suspicion rather than genuine concern. For a brief moment, I genuinely didn't understand what she meant, so I glanced down at my clothes and asked her to clarify, still assuming this was some sort of misunderstanding that could be resolved in seconds. She gestured vaguely at my hoodie and said that people who dress like that make her nervous, delivering the statement as if it were an objective fact rather than a personal fear. I felt a tightening in my chest, but kept my voice neutral as I explained that I was simply jogging, and that the hoodie was because of the cold, hoping practicality would override whatever assumption she had already formed. Instead of relaxing, her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms while telling me that this was a safe neighborhood, and that she didn't think people should be running around looking suspicious, a phrase that immediately made it clear she had already decided what she thought of me. I told her that I lived nearby and that I ran this route regularly, offering familiarity as reassurance, but she ignored that entirely, glancing up and down the street as if looking for validation from an invisible audience. Realizing the conversation was going nowhere and unwilling to stand there justifying myself, I turned slightly to continue my run, only to hear her voice snap sharply behind me, demanding that I not walk away. I stopped again, irritation now openly present, and told her calmly but firmly that I wasn't doing anything wrong, even as I could feel the situation slipping from awkward into confrontational. That was when she raised her phone, held it up deliberately, and announced that she was calling the police, not with anger, but with a calm certainty that made the accusation feel even heavier. I stared at her in disbelief, asking what she could possibly tell them, as she responded without hesitation that I was acting suspicious by running around in a hoodie and making people uncomfortable. At that point, I understood that logic wasn't going to change her mind, so I stepped a few feet away and waited, knowing that leaving would only reinforce whatever narrative she was already creating. As she spoke into her phone, nearby signs of attention began to surface, with a couple walking their dog slowing down across the street, and a curtain shifting in her front window as someone peeked outside to see what was happening. The quiet calm of the neighborhood was replaced by a tense stillness as everyone waited, even though nothing illegal had occurred, and the entire situation revolved around nothing more than clothing and assumption. When the police car finally pulled onto the street, its lights briefly flashing before shutting off, the mood shifted instantly, transforming an ordinary jog into an official investigation under the gaze of watching neighbors. Two officers stepped out and approached calmly, their professional demeanor contrasting sharply with the exaggerated concern that had prompted the call, as one of them asked who had contacted emergency services. The woman immediately identified herself and pointed toward me, explaining that she had seen me running around in a hoodie and that it made her feel unsafe, framing her fear as justification rather than examining its cause. The officers turned their attention to me and asked what was going on, and I explained steadily that I was jogging, that I lived nearby, and that the issue seemed to be my clothing rather than my actions. When they asked for identification and I explained that I didn't carry a wallet while running, the woman interjected triumphantly as if that alone proved wrongdoing, only to be calmly corrected by an officer who explained that most runners don't carry ID. They asked about my route, how often I ran, and where I lived, and I answered each question clearly, while one officer nodded and remarked that everything sounded completely normal. Frustration crept across the woman's face as she insisted that the officers were ignoring the obvious problem, repeatedly pointing to my hoodie as if fabric alone constituted a threat. One officer responded firmly that wearing a hoodie was not suspicious, illegal, or grounds for a police stop, explaining that discomfort did not equal criminal behavior. When she continued to argue that she was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe, the officer informed her that calling 911 over someone jogging was an inappropriate use of emergency services and could have consequences if repeated. Her confidence visibly collapsed as she crossed her arms and looked away, muttering under her breath, while the officers apologized to me for the interruption and told me I was free to continue my run. They remained behind briefly to speak with her privately, likely explaining boundaries and responsibility, before returning to their vehicle and leaving the street as quietly as they had arrived. As I resumed jogging, my pace slower now, I felt the weight of the encounter settle in, not as fear, but as a deep exhaustion that came from realizing how easily normal behavior could be misinterpreted. The houses passed by again, unchanged and quiet, but the sense of ease I had started the run with was gone, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that appearance alone had been enough to escalate the situation. Later that evening, after finishing my run and cooling down, a neighbor I recognized stopped me to apologize, explaining that the same woman had previously called the police on delivery drivers as strangers she didn't recognize. That confirmation made it clear that the incident wasn't about safety at all, but about control, fear, and the assumptions people choose to make when they feel entitled to police others. That night, as I hung my hoodie back in the closet, I couldn't stop thinking about how something as harmless as jogging had turned into a police encounter simply because someone decided I didn't belong. The experience stayed with me long after the run ended, serving as a reminder that in the real world, normal actions can become suspicious in the wrong eyes, and sometimes existing quietly is enough to make someone dial 911.